In 1959, General Motors did something that automakers almost never do. They took a car that was arguably the most perfectly resolved design Chevrolet had ever produced, a car buyers were lining up to buy, a car that was outselling projections during one of the worst recessions in American history, and they killed it. Not because it failed. Not because customers hated it. Not because it was unsafe or unreliable or outdated. They killed it because it was too good too fast. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how a car this beloved, this influential, and this perfectly engineered got exactly 12 months to exist before General Motors erased it completely. But stick around, because the real reason this happened isn't what you think, and there's a twist near the end of this story that even serious car collectors don't fully know. Let's get into it. To understand why the 1958 Chevrolet Impala vanished so fast, you first need to understand what Chevrolet actually was heading into that year. Chevrolet had spent decades as America's value brand, the reliable, no-frills choice for working families who needed a car, not a statement. That reputation had made Chevrolet the best-selling automaker in the country for years running. But there was a problem hiding underneath that success. America's middle class was growing fast in the post-war boom, and those buyers had more disposable income than any generation before them. They wanted something that felt special, something a step above basic transportation, but they weren't ready to pay Cadillac or Buick money to get it. Ford saw that same gap and responded by launching an entirely new brand to chase it, a brand called Edsel. Chevrolet's response was quieter, cheaper, and far less risky. Instead of inventing a whole new nameplate, Chevrolet planners decided to build a new top-tier trim level that would sit above their existing flagship, the Bel Air. It seemed like a small, safe decision at the time. Nobody in that room could have predicted just how right they were about to get it, or how quickly they'd throw the whole thing away. Here's something almost nobody knows about this car. It very nearly wasn't called Impala at all. Early proposals floated the name Bel Air Executive, a flat, corporate label for what was supposed to be Chevrolet's most upscale car yet. When the name Impala was finally pitched, borrowed from an African antelope known for speed and grace, it didn't land well in the room. Chevrolet's own general manager reportedly brushed it off, calling it little more than the name of a goat. Let that sink in for a second, because this name would go on to become one of the most recognized nameplates in American automotive history, running for over 60 years and selling in the tens of millions. And it almost got tossed in the trash because one executive thought it sounded too much like livestock. So where did the actual shape of this car come from? This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because the 1958 Impala wasn't designed in a vacuum. It was the production echo of two show cars that had toured GM's Motorama circuit years earlier. The first was a 1955 concept called the Biscayne, a four-door hardtop with a toothy grille, bug-eyed headlights, and a scalloped body side that flowed directly into the Impala's rear deck. If you line up photos of that concept next to the finished production car, the resemblance is unmistakable. The second influence came a year later with a concept literally named the Corvette Impala, which is actually where the Impala name first appeared publicly, 2 full years before it ever reached a showroom floor. And the styling didn't stop with GM's own concept cars. Look closely at the side trim running down the flanks of a 1958 Impala, and you're looking at a design lineage that traces back to a 1954 Fiat Coupe styled by the Italian house Ghia. There's even a persistent rumor among collectors, never officially confirmed, that the strange non-functional scoop mounted above the rear window took visual inspiration from the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, a car that was turning heads across Europe at the exact same time. And that scoop deserves its own moment because it's one of the strangest footnotes in this car's entire development. It wasn't supposed to be fake. GM's engineers originally designed it to be fully functional, an air extractor meant to pull stale cabin air out through the roofline as the car moved down the highway, keeping the interior fresh without cranking a window down. Clever idea on paper. But in wind tunnel and road testing, engineers discovered the exact opposite of what they expected. The spot where they placed the vent sat in a low-pressure zone at speed, which meant instead of sucking air out, it was actually pulling outside air in. Rather than redesign it and risk delaying production, GM just gave up and made it decorative. A sculpted shape with zero function, purely there to look fast. And here's the twist. That little trick became something of a GM signature for the next decade. The 1963 Corvette rolled out with fake hood vents. The Buick Riviera carried a fake rear air extractor that did absolutely nothing. It wasn't until 1971 that GM's full-size cars finally got a genuinely functional version, and even then it barely worked any better than the fake one had. Now here's where things start to get seriously impressive, because underneath all of that styling sat engineering that mattered far more than trim pieces and vents. The entire 1958 Chevrolet lineup rode on a completely new chassis, something Chevrolet had never done before. Every Chevrolet before this used a conventional perimeter frame. For 1958, engineers threw that out entirely and introduced an X-shaped frame, marketed as a safety girder design, with the rails converging toward the center of the car instead of running parallel down each side. This wasn't cosmetic. By narrowing the frame toward the middle, GM's engineers could drop the entire passenger compartment significantly lower without sacrificing interior space, which gave the whole lineup that long, low, wide look that defined late 50s American car advertising. The wheelbase grew, the car stretched past 209 inches long, and height dropped by nearly 4 inches on some models. All of that came at a cost though. The new car ended up around 150 to 200 pounds heavier than the model it replaced. A real problem for engineers chasing performance in an era before computers made weight optimization easy. The suspension changed just as dramatically. Chevrolet dropped the leaf springs that had handled rear suspension for years and moved to coil springs at all four corners. But Chevrolet also offered something wildly ambitious as an option, a true four-wheel air suspension system, rubber bellows at each wheel fed by an engine-driven compressor, designed to self-level the car and smooth out the ride regardless of load. It sounds remarkably similar to air suspension systems that wouldn't become common on luxury cars for decades. But in 1958, the materials and manufacturing tolerances needed to make it reliable simply didn't exist yet. The system leaked constantly. The compressor drained real engine power just running it. GM ended up recalling huge numbers of these units and refunding customers who'd paid extra for a feature that mostly caused headaches. Which is exactly why genuine surviving 1958 Impalas with their original air suspensions still intact are almost impossible to find today. But if you want to know what really built this car's legend, you have to look under the hood. The base engine was a modest inline-six. Most performance buyers stepped up to a 283 cubic inch V8 available in a huge range of tunes, all the way up to a fuel-injected variant pushing close to 250 horsepower. Genuinely advanced technology for a mainstream American car at that time. But the engine that mattered most for Chevrolet's future wasn't either of those. It was a brand new 348 cubic inch V8 marketed as the turbo thrust, and in its top tri-power configuration, output climbed as high as roughly 315 horsepower. Here's why that engine actually matters. It was the direct ancestor of the 348's most famous descendant, the legendary 409 cubic inch V8 that Chevrolet would release a few years later, an engine so iconic it eventually got its own hit song. Every muscle car enthusiast who ever chased a 409 owes something to the engineering work quietly done under the hood of this one-year-only Impala that most people have already forgotten existed. And this is where a pattern starts showing up again and again across this car's entire story. Chevrolet kept gambling on ambitious new engineering in 1958, and again, it was the simpler, more conservative solution that actually survived long-term. The advanced Turbo Glide automatic transmission was discontinued by 1961 in favor of the tougher, simpler Power Glide. The air suspension got recalled and quietly replaced with coil springs. Even the radical X-frame chassis itself, despite being genuinely innovative, offered noticeably less side impact protection than the traditional perimeter frame it replaced, because it lacked a continuous rail running down each side of the car. Safety standards in 1958 were nowhere near strict enough for that trade-off to matter publicly at the time, but it's exactly the kind of detail that explains why GM eventually walked away from this design entirely. So by every measure that should matter, this car should have struggled. It launched during a real recession, with unemployment pushing toward 8%, arguably one of the worst possible years to release a new, more expensive model. And yet the Impala did the opposite of struggling. Chevrolet sold around 125,000 sport coupes and just under 56,000 convertibles in that first year alone. Remarkable numbers for a brand new nameplate launched straight into a shrinking economy. The Impala alone helped push Chevrolet back into its familiar spot as America's best-selling automaker, a title the brand had briefly lost ground on. Whatever risk GM took building this car, the market answered clearly. People wanted it badly. So here's the real question. If this car was this good, this beloved, this perfectly resolved, why on earth did General Motors kill it after just 12 months? The answer starts with fear. And it starts with Chrysler. Throughout 1957, Chrysler's entire lineup was undergoing a dramatic transformation under design chief Virgil Exner, marketed under the tagline Forward Look. These cars were lower, sharper, and more aggressively finned than anything else on American roads. When they hit showrooms, they made GM's existing lineup look conservative almost overnight. GM had already locked in its plans for the 1959 model year, plans that would have kept this exact same Impala body and X-frame chassis rolling forward with only minor updates. But when GM stylists and executives actually saw what Chrysler had built, the reaction inside the design studios was close to panic. Rather than risk showing up to 1959 looking dated next to Chrysler's radical new shapes, GM made an extraordinarily costly decision. They scrapped the entire 1959 plan and rushed out an all-new design from scratch, sharing far more sheet metal and structure across GM's different divisions to help offset the expense of that emergency redesign. And that's it. That's the whole reason. This perfect, beloved, record-selling car wasn't replaced because it failed. It was replaced because one rival automaker's styling scared GM's executives enough to burn an entire year of engineering and start over from zero. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about, the part that makes this whole story sting even more. The 1959 cars that replaced this Impala pushed the formula so far that GM's full-size lineup ended up with some of the lowest seating positions ever put into a full-size American car, seats mounted almost directly on the floor just to preserve headroom under that dramatically lower roofline. It didn't work. Complaints about comfort and visibility got so bad that GM had to quietly raise seat height back up again by 1961. Correcting a decision that had gone a step too far in the rush to outdo Chrysler. In other words, GM panicked, threw away a genuinely perfect car, and replaced it with something they had to partially undo 2 years later. It's worth pausing here to compare how differently this exact bet played out for Ford. Remember, both companies spotted the exact same gap in the market at the exact same time. Ford's answer was to build a brand new brand entirely, complete with its own dealer network, its own advertising, its own identity, separate from the Ford name altogether. Chevrolet's answer was smaller and far more conservative, a trim package layered onto an existing model, using the same dealers who already sold every other Chevrolet, built around a name some Chevrolet executives weren't even convinced was a good idea. History remembers how those two bets turned out. Edsel became one of the most infamous commercial failures in American automotive history. Discontinued after just a few years, its name still used today as business school shorthand for a launch that completely misread its audience. The Impala, meanwhile, launched straight into a recession, on a body engineered to last exactly one model year, and still went on to become one of the best-selling nameplates in the history of the American automobile. Lower risk, in this case, turned out to be the far smarter play, by an enormous margin. So here's where all of this leaves us. The 1958 Chevrolet Impala wasn't a placeholder. It wasn't a test run. It was a fully realized, heavily engineered, genuinely perfect new direction for Chevrolet, built with its own unique frame, its own suspension, its own engine, and a styling identity borrowed from two influential show cars and refined by one of the most respected design teams in Detroit's history. It launched into one of the worst economic environments imaginable and still crushed expectations. It quietly gave birth to an engine platform that would become a muscle car legend within just a few years. And it did all of that while existing for exactly one model year, permanently overshadowed by a single moment of panic after GM stylists caught a glimpse of what Chrysler was building across town. Sometimes the most memorable cars in automotive history aren't the ones that stuck around the longest. Sometimes they're the ones that got exactly one shot to make an impression, and made it count so completely that people are still talking about it almost 70 years later. Today, that exact scarcity, the fact that this body was never repeated, the fact that this chassis was replaced within a year, the fact that so many surviving examples have been customized, wrecked, or simply lost to time, is precisely what makes a genuine, well-preserved 1958 Impala convertible worth well into six figures at auction today. Not bad at all, for a car that Chevrolet's own general manager once dismissed as being named after a goat.